Welcome to the Connected Leadership Podcast Live. We're back again. It's an early Friday morning episode this time. Thank you very much for joining me. If you haven't joined the live broadcast before, this is me conducting my interviews for future episodes of the Connected Leadership Podcast. But over the last couple of months, I've started streaming them live on YouTube, on LinkedIn and on Facebook, and you're very welcome to join us and be part of the conversation as well. So this particular interview will be going out on the podcast in about 3 weeks time, I think it is, but you get your chance to get first bite at the cherry. So the way this normally works is we conduct 2 interviews with my guest. The first interview is on a theme, which I'll introduce in a moment, and the second interview always follows the same format. The first one is roughly 45 minutes. Then we go straight into the second interview, which is about 15 minutes. Small gap in between, very brief. And then on the podcast, they come out respectively on the Monday and the Thursday. I'm giving you a bit of time to join us before I introduce my guest, because I know it takes a while for people to think what's going on here and join it. But I've just remembered to open up my comments, and I can see that Wojciech has joined us on LinkedIn. So Wojciech, thank you very much for joining us. As Wojciech has done, whether you're on LinkedIn, Facebook or YouTube, you are more than welcome to join the conversation. Just pop something into the chat. I keep my eye on it throughout the interview. Something new that I keep telling myself I have to do. This is being broadcast live at 10:05 on Friday morning, the 28th of May. I say that because occasionally at different points during the day or the week, I see people come in having watching it on replay without realizing it and suddenly saying, "Hello, Andy," as if I'm live. So if you're here on Friday morning, UK time, the 28th, then say hi now, but comment at any point, because my guests and I will go back and see any comments. Enough waffle. Let's get on with the podcast. My guest today, and I'm going to bring her on screen to join me. Looks like she's the new chair of Mastermind, doesn't she? Sitting in her black chair with a black background. I feel like I'm the one going to be facing all the questions, Jane. My guest is Jane Gunn, who I have known for a number of years through our fellow membership of the Professional Speaking Association. And Jane's specialist topic this week, you can sense a theme coming here, but Jane's specialist topic this week is conflict resolution. Jane is a mediator known as the Barefoot Mediator, and we'll explore why that is as we go through the conversation. But the topic for today is conflict resolution, and in fact, how do you avoid conflicts in the first place? And obviously, with the premise of the podcast being that professional relationships underpin executive success, one of the biggest challenges that we haven't talked about on the podcast before, but is absolutely key when it comes to professional relationships, is maintaining them when you have differences of agreement. And actually, even when those differences mean you struggle to work together anymore, finding a way where you can move forward. And so it seems like a very key topic. I don't know if you have a very key topic. It seems like a key topic for the Connected Leadership podcast. So Jane, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Andy. I've been looking forward to it.
Me too. So let's get straight into the nuts and bolts of it, because I doubt that there are very many people listening to the podcast who haven't experienced conflict in some form or another over the course of their career. What are the main triggers for disputes? So let's look at the two elements. What triggers disputes in the first place most commonly, and what pours gas on the fire? What escalates them?
I'm just going to go back a step, Andy, and talk about conflict being a process. And conflict is the process by which we express our unhappiness, dissatisfaction, discontent with another person in a situation. And there's, as you say, there's always a trigger. And then that process continues until we manage it in some way. And then we may end up at what I call a dispute, which is the product, the end point of an unresolved conflict. But a conflict is just this ongoing process of us behaving in ways that express our dissatisfaction with another person or a situation. And the trigger can be all sorts of things. It can be a conversation that doesn't go well. I mean, typically my mantra is that conflict comes from a conversation that didn't happen or didn't happen well. So we forgot to be clear about what we meant, or I actually myself had a misunderstanding with a colleague this week, and it's simply the words we used, and they think one thing and I think something else, and we both act on our assumption, and then we're going in different directions. And then, depending on our own assumptions and our own sort of mindset, we get upset by that and we think, how could they possibly have behaved like that? And we end up going down a different track. So conflict itself is quite a simple premise, but that the challenge with it is it escalates after that.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So let's pick up on a conversation that didn't happen or a conversation that didn't go well. And I think we can explore each of those in turn, because I can certainly think of more than one, sadly, scenario for both. And I'm sure I'm not alone with that. Let's start with a conversation that didn't happen. I think that many people's approach to avoiding conflict is to avoid the conversation that might lead to conflict, which
Yes.
in turn leads to simmering resentment, unvoiced issues, and actually misunderstandings as a result of not opening that. How do you help people overcome their fears about having that conversation and move towards trying to get some resolution?
It's so interesting. Why don't people have that conversation? I've just returned from working with a company yesterday, and we looked at why don't they have those conversations professionally. And for them, number one was, I don't want to rock the boat. So very often, and I find this if I'm working, so this is an organization where they've actually got quite a solid culture. People like working there. So the challenge then is, I don't want to be the person who's going to rock the boat. Then again, people say, well, I don't know how to have that conversation. It is a difficult conversation, and I don't quite know how to start it, how to go on with it. What happens if one of us becomes emotional? So there's a kind of fear factor there. And then again, sometimes we're worried about the consequences. What if I say something and then lose my job? Or what if I say something and damage a relationship? So there's all sorts of levels of why we don't actually start the conversation. And often not rocking the boat is one, but what's the consequence of not rocking the boat?
So I think we can all recognise what the consequences are, but I don't necessarily think that helps us actually have the bravery, the courage to have the conversation. I do want to then go into how do you have that conversation in a way that will avoid rocking the boat as best as possible, because I suppose there are no guarantees. Mm-hmm. You're not in control of the other person's response. But first step is, let's not worry about other people for the moment. How do I overcome my fear and my reticence to have that conversation in the first place? I know that if I have the conversation and it's a good one, then we get past this. But I also know what happens if that conversation goes the wrong way. I can't be bothered. I'm blaming the other person. Why do I need them in my life? All these things are going on in my head. How do I get past that?
It's interesting that you say that, Andy, and I think a lot of times, as you alluded to at the beginning of the podcast here, sometimes it is about ending a relationship, actually. But the thing is, even if you could end that relationship well, rather than just say, I can't be bothered with that person anymore, but to be quite open and honest. And one of the key things is about sharing your meaning and intent. This is what I meant, and this is my intention. Sometimes we misinterpret people's intentions. We assume that they meant to hurt us, meant to upset us, meant to be late for the appointment or whatever. We make an assumption, and then we behave according to that assumption. And our brains generally make the worst assumption. And then the thing that we actually lack is the skill to approach that conversation with the right mindset, and then the sort of right approach, the right words. How do I do that? Because if I'm angry, I probably then launch at you and say, did you realize you were late? Or did you know you've just upset me? Or, we launch in, and then you become defensive, and literally within seconds, we've gone down a rabbit hole. And that's what happens. And so it's thinking about, how do I change my mindset? and then approach this conversation in a way that gives it a better chance of a better outcome.
Yeah, and that give it a better chance. There are no guarantees, but at least you
No.
you can sleep easy at night that
Yeah.
you tried what was right. And it was interesting
Yeah.
you saying that how we interpret other people's intent. One of the I did a self-development program a number of years ago called Landmark, and one of the biggest things that I learnt on Landmark is our tendency to apply meaning to other people's actions or words that I think they're saying is nothing has any meaning other than the meaning we apply to it. And I look, at my own relationships over the years, and I can see that time and time again where it's happened both ways. So that's key. So okay, so we say okay, I'm going to have this conversation because at least for myself, I know I've tried in the most professional and the most respectable way I can to try and do the right thing. And if it doesn't work out, that's fine. I can move on, clearing the knowledge. Then it comes to actually having that conversation. And I mean, I've been there where I've had a conversation with someone with the intention of trying to explain how I feel, explain what has happened, and the response has been an emotional, defensive one from the other person that's escalated things. And I'm sure other people would say the same about conversations with me. I'm not going to make myself out to be any saint in this respect at all. How can we give ourselves the best chance of ensuring that conversation has a happy outcome for both parties?
I think the first tip I would give, Andy, is the setup. Don't spring it on someone. If you want to have a serious conversation, make sure that you've got the time, they've got the time, and that even you've set aside a space to say, could we have half an hour together? I'd really like to talk to you about X or Y, or I'd really like to have a conversation with you. Because if you spring it on someone, they're going to go, oh, what was that? I didn't expect that, or I had no idea that was coming. So that's the first thing, the setup. And then the second thing is, how do you approach it? Is it not always, but should you give them some warning? I want to talk to you about X, or I want to talk to you about Y. Can we have some time together? And then I think just being sort of quite straightforward, really. You talk about saying how you feel, but I think there are some sort of key things to say, not accusing someone, you did X, but, this is what I saw. One of the things I talk about is the power of 10, and that's the power of being tentative. If you've made an assumption about someone, you need to check that out. My business partner used to say, let's test assumptions to extinction. But, if I'm assuming someone's done something negligently, deliberately, whatever, they've upset me, you could say, well, I asked you to do such and such, but I'm assuming you haven't done it, but I might be wrong. So in conversations like that, you're giving people the benefit of the doubt. You're checking, am I right? Am I wrong? And you're also giving power back to them to say, no, actually, there's a different explanation. And those kind of things can help. So that's the start, really, Andy. Giving them the benefit of the doubt and checking, did I miss something there? Was I wrong about your intention, or what you actually did or didn't do?
I think that's a really refreshing approach, and we had a recent guest on the podcast was Dr. Alison Horsemeyer, and we talked about curiosity, and you're making me think. Well, let's take curiosity into these conversations rather than a desire to be vindicated, a desire to be right.
Absolutely, Andy. And you can even use words like, I'm curious, I'm wondering if, I'd just like to, I'd just like to find out, I'd like to discover. Again, I don't like to be prescriptive about what words people use. If you go in with a kind of script sheet, it's going to sound phony. These are just ideas, and they're not always right in the circumstances. The key thing is it depends, and it always depends on the person, the circumstances. You've got to be equipped to react to what's happening rather than, I'm reading off a script sheet that Jane gave me, because that's not going to work either.
Absolutely, yeah. And I always say the same about conversations. That people say, "What do you say at networking events?" And I said I always say there are books that will give you a list of questions to ask people at a networking event, and you sound like someone who's read a book with a list of questions to ask people. Your conversation in any environment has got to come from being in, as our friend Nigel Risner was saying. I always seem to quote Nigel on this podcast one way or another, but be in the room, be in the conversation. And I guess that's more than essential in this type of case.
It is, Andy, and I think the key word is conversation. It is a two-way thing. You're having a conversation, and the point of a conversation is, what do I most want? How do I get someone to hear what I want to say, and how do I listen to and hear what someone else wants to say? And those two components of a conversation are also interesting.
Great. Okay, so let's have a look at context. So where these disputes, where these conflicts arise, do you see a difference between internal disputes, for example, within a leadership team, or between colleagues, and those with external stakeholders, so a client, a supplier, for example, and how they tend to escalate, how they're handled?
Yes, possibly. But I think, there are many common elements to them. And I guess people always come back to, has somebody broken some kind of promise that I expected them to keep? Often, particularly in the workplace. It's, for example, working with an organization recently, one of the key things was people keep asking me to do things which are not in my work description. And I feel that's an imposition on me. How do I tell my boss that I don't want to do that because it's outside my work description, and also it's also stopping me from doing something else I should be doing. So there's all kinds of things there. With a client, maybe much more. Maybe there's a misunderstanding about delivering a product or service. Was it delivered on time? Was it what they expected? Did we breach some sort of element of the contract that they're concerned about? Did we not pay on time? Did they not pay us? These are all the kind of things that come up in with external suppliers and clients.
So I guess that with the external suppliers and clients, you're more likely to have a written agreement than you are between colleagues, which makes your role, I would imagine, a lot easier.
Yes, it sort of does, except it's never really about the contract. It is much more about so I talk about, and in one of my books, I talk about something called a living contract, which is where you are much more explicit about what were my expectations of you. Because a formal contract, simply sets out, well, I'm going to deliver this service or product, it's going to be delivered on this date, and various legal things about it. But what's the expectation around our relationship in that? How do I think that's going to be delivered? What are the kind of things that would upset me? And trying to think about those things in an important and long-standing relationship, and saying, well, here's the reason we're doing this. This is why this is important to me and important to you. Here's the results that I expect and you expect. How will we know that we've achieved those results for you? Are things you don't normally write in a legal contract. And so those are the kind of things that you can have a good conversation about, and sometimes even write a sort of note about, that doesn't need to be a formal contract, but it just helps you to be clear about your intentions with each other.
And would you do that within an internal context as well, between colleagues?
Yes, exactly. Yep. So, I mean, in a workplace, you are talking about an employment contract, and of course, most challenges between employees get escalated through the HR department, the HR director, and they end up going there. And what I see happens mostly is that instead of dealing with things ad hoc as they arise, people store up in a kind of little black book, but they store up their grievances, and then they say, right, I've now got enough issues about this situation or this person to lodge a complaint or lodge a grievance, or it's the 6-monthly assessment, I'll give my feedback on that colleague. And of course that's not really very effective, because it's hiding information, it's not being open and transparent, and it's allowing things to escalate.
As an HR leader, or as a team or a division leader, does it make sense to try and create some kind of structure that allows people to air those grievances sooner? And have you seen this done well in any particular examples?
That's absolutely what I go into my clients to do, Andy, is to say, create a framework within your organization for managing conflict. Educate all your staff the very, very basics of conflict. This is a thing. It happens every day. When it happens, here's what our responsibility as employees in this company is in terms of managing it. Manage it early, manage it face to face. Here's some skills that might help you. If not, bring in a third party, and you can train third parties within the organization to act as facilitators of those conversations before you escalate it to a formal process. And that can save masses of time, heartache and costs across an organization.
One of the things that sprang to my mind when I was thinking about this conversation was that, this podcast, my books are all about the power of strong relationships. But if I think back, I have a gut feeling that the stronger and the deeper the relationship, the bigger the potential conflict. As people take things more personally. I was going to ask you if that is the case. It clearly is. Can you give us some more insight into that, and how you recognise the signs and how you handle that kind of environment? Can you turn it around so that strong relationship protects you rather than leads to deeper grievance?
I'm going to leap back a step there, Andy, and talk about one of the things that underpins my work is a paper that comes out of Harvard, which is, if you want to collaborate and have collaborative relationships, the first thing you must do, and actually the foundation of your relationship, is to accept, acknowledge, and actively manage conflict. So in other words, conflict sits at the heart of the best relationships, the best collaboration, because we know it's there. We're not pretending it's not there, but we're managing it early. We're accepting, acknowledging, and actively managing it. So it is that, and I talk in my books and my work about the magic of conflict. It's something that I actually describe it like water. If you didn't water your garden, it wouldn't grow, and that's the same with your relationship. And all it is acknowledging these catalysts, these incidents, these times where we don't fully understand each other, where we upset each other, and exploring them. So you can talk about it as an exploration, and yes, it may lead to you deciding you don't want to work with that person anymore, but it may well lead to a deepening of the understanding and the relationship, which is what you're hoping for.
And we hear about creative conflict, don't we? And how that's such a positive thing. And if handled correctly, conflict can actually lead to much stronger outcomes, can't it?
It does. And so one of the things I do in a mediation, if you imagine two people in a legal dispute and they think, oh, I'm just suing them and I'm going to get some compensation, I'm going to get some money. But what we do then is we say, well, what else is this about? And what else could you do to help that person, A, understand where you're coming from, but also B, to give them more value? It's about, in the business sense, adding value. What else could we do together to add value? And often my clients who've been at loggerheads and digging out their contracts and suing each other then sit down and think, oh, look at that, we could do business in a different way. And it is about exploring that, as you say, Andy, with your creative hat on. Let's get creative about this and think of better ways.
Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot then. And you don't have to give me an accurate, a specific answer unless there have been studies that show this, but what percentage of conflicts that you've come across do you feel you can find and let's talk about deep conflicts, not light ones, but where it appears that both parties are at complete loggerheads with each other, opposite poles, what percentage of those do you feel, well, actually, if we work together the right way, I can get you working back closely together again and create something new out of this?
I can give you the statistics from mediations themselves, which are generally sort of commercial relationships which have broken down. And the statistics are that 85% of mediations are successful, even though people might be in some kind of formal process at the time. How creative they are is another question. And, that does require people to sort of enter into a particular mindset and think, let's get really excited about what the opportunities are for working together. But those are always there.
How do you define successful?
Well, it's not my definition. Is the
How
answer,
does the study
Andy.
define? How does the study define
Oh,
successful?
well, that study is defining successful by, did they not pursue their formal process, but they reached some kind of settlement. And in the work that I do, they would probably sign a formal kind of settlement arrangement. They'd agree that we're going to stop this formal process. We've agreed to these terms, and we're going to move on from there. Success then, and I often follow up with my clients over a much longer term, is, how is it 6 months later? How is it a year later? Are you still conforming to the spirit of the agreement you entered into? What's working, what's not working? And I think you're back to that kind of living contract again. You've got to be prepared to keep digging this up and saying, is it working? Is it not working? What's not working on this sort of formal relationship level?
So if we were to define success somewhere differently, and I think if I use an analogy of a marriage, I think that the definition of success that you've suggested is that you've agreed to split, but it's amicable now. If we move that back to the divorce is off, we're back living together and as happy as we ever were, just what percentage do you think that is possible?
I think I have to be realistic, Annie. So I don't know the percentage, but it's not always possible. And I think that's been one of the transformations for me in my thinking, in my work, is I used to think this is such a miraculous process that I can administer mediation. I can go into a workplace relationship and help people to get back on track. And then I realized, no, that's not always the case. Fundamentally, some people are not suited to an organization. They don't fit with the values, they don't fit with the culture. But then the question is, can we deal with that kindly? And partly it is about being kind and clear with someone. Here's what's not working and here's how we can help you, but we do need to move on from this, and doing that in a way which is respectful, which enables both people to move on without having to hang on to that. It's one of the things with conflict is we often hold it in our heart for a long time. So, you might go to court with a big litigation, and the judge might say, right, I'm awarding you X in compensation for your loss, but you've still got that conflict in your heart. You've settled it, but you haven't resolved it. And there's a difference between those two things. So looking at how can you help people find a resolution which enables them to draw a line in the sand and then move on and say, I'm done with that now. I can move on. I've learned what I needed to learn from it. We've both learned from each other. And I did this quite recently with an organization where they really wanted to say, I'd like to be able to recommend that person in the future. I'd maybe even like to work with them in the future, but we just need to end this particular relationship on right terms.
I think I'm really pleased to hear you say that, and I'm glad I asked the question, because as I asked it, I thought this sounds like such a dumb question, but I knew that there was a reason for it, and I think that recognition that resolution doesn't necessarily mean everyone's happy and working together again, but resolution is everyone is happy and can move on, even if it's apart, is the adult way of looking at it. So so thank you for that. Let's talk a bit more about your role as a mediator, because you've referenced that a few times, and not everyone will have worked with a mediator before, and I'm sure many people think of the mediator as the port of last resort. You've talked about your work encouraging clients to put in that conflict resolution into their business model and the way that they run early on. How bad do things need to get before you need to bring a mediator in to help you resolve them?
They shouldn't need to get that bad. I think, people always call me when the kitchen's on fire rather than, that they want me to come in and clean it all up and make them a nice omelette. Well, that's not, I think often my clients could have called me earlier. And that's the frustration for me. But many business clients don't know how to find a mediator. They don't know what a mediator does. And they don't have one on call, or that. So that's the challenge for them is this actual knowledge of what could a mediator do. And then on the other hand, if they do have some conflict resolution skills within their organization, they should be initiating those as well. But more perhaps about what the mediator does.
So, I mean, obviously, people now know a little bit more about mediators, and they know to reach out to you if they need one. But this podcast is listened to around the world, and you won't be the right fit for everyone.
No.
How would people find a mediator? Would most law firms offer mediation services? Would that be your first port of call? Would you Google mediator, or how would you go about it?
I think you need to Google a mediator provider or a mediator provider. So I belong to two, and I'm probably about to join a third, mediation chambers. So it's a bit like how barristers operate. And I belong to one called IPOS, which used to stand for In Place of Strife, which is a great name. And I belong to another international chambers called ARB-DB Chambers. So you can go to these providers, and the way they will operate then is they'll take a note of your conflict, and they'll probably offer you a choice of 3 mediators. So you actually then can think, oh, I wonder which one suits us best. And of course, even choosing a mediator should be something that you collaborate over. Both people have got to agree that they think this person is right and they trust this person. So that's the way to do that.
Yeah, I guess you can't just bring in a mediator. One party can't just bring them in. That's the first thing that's got to be mediated. It is that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of your approach specifically, I noticed that you've embraced this title of the Barefoot Mediator. What does that image represent, and why is that so important?
Well, it's a great question, Andy. So this time last year, I suppose, we'd all gone into lockdown and I was transforming to doing my work online. And actually today, the same. I'm sitting here with no shoes on. So actually, building rapport and all that you do in networking, Andy, I was building rapport with my clients who had not met before online. I just said, I've got no shoes and I'm the Barefoot Mediator. And then I was a guest on a webinar later, and I was introduced as the Barefoot Mediator because I told my colleagues that I'd made this comment. And so I stopped and thought, well, I wonder what that is. Is it a thing? And I did a little bit of research around this term barefoot. One of the areas where it originates from is in China with the barefoot doctors. And some of us have heard that name. And the barefoot doctors were really like paramedics who worked out in the rural areas where people couldn't easily afford to or get transport to main hospitals and doctors. And so what I've always wanted to do, and what this made me think is what I need to get across to people is the essence of what I do as a mediator. Not everybody wants to or needs to be a mediator, and I've done a lot of training of other commercial mediators. But what if we could just get out to people this essence of what mediation is and what being barefoot really means? And I'll just give you one other thing there, Andy. One of the things that's inspired me a lot in my work is understanding the 3 levels of professional development. For me, 3 levels of development as a mediator. The first is you do learn these mediation skills. The second is you start practicing them and trying them out. And we've talked about that this morning. But the third level of development for me as a mediator and all of us as professionals is a growing awareness of myself. What difference do I make in a situation, either negative or positive, when I'm practicing those skills and when I'm being me? And it's about being. So to me, barefoot mediation is about being a mediator rather than doing mediation. It's about putting those skills at the heart of who I am and what I do every single day, and encouraging other people to be able to do the same in their families, in their workplace, in their communities, not to to be a barefoot mediator, if you like, or I also call it to be a resolutionary. That's it in a nutshell.
I love the term resolutionary. You've just got me thinking. So there's another analogy here, which I hadn't thought about before, which is the football referee. You know, I'm a big football fan, and one of the things that's always said about referees is the referee has had a good game if you haven't noticed him.
Yes.
Now,
Yeah.
you've talked about bringing yourself into the mediation role, which almost seems to be at conflict with that suggestion. So how do those two fit together? Because I'm sure and your response tells me, I'm sure you could say the same about a mediator. The best mediators, are almost invisible, but just almost directing the action
No, that's
subtly.
absolutely true. And I've got a little poem in my book there called The Tao of the Mediator, which says, at the end of the day, with the best mediator, the parties think they've done it themselves. So one of the key principles that not all mediators operate by is, and I'm very passionate about in all areas of life, is self-determination. All I'm doing is helping people to make the best decision they can make with the best skill set in the circumstances. So it's not about me giving my opinion. It's not about me passing judgment. It's not about me influencing anybody in any way, despite the fact that I'm a lawyer with many years of training. It's about me facilitating their conversation to the extent that they feel empowered to make their own decision as to how they want to go forward. So self-determination. And when they do that, yes, I fade into the background. I don't need to be there. So absolutely right.
So how does that sit with you bringing yourself into the role? Where you were sort of describing the barefoot mediator. How do you bring yourself into the role and yet not bring your judgment, not bring and fade into the background? How do the two sit together?
I think it is those things. When you use the word judgment, Andy, it is about me being self-aware. So I think many of us, when we would be a third party in a conflict, might be trying to, and generally in conversations, might be trying to influence, coerce others into ways of acting and behaving, and actually being aware of my own behavior and my own mindset and challenging that, because what I'm trying to be as a mediator is neutral. And neutral is, again, my business partner used to say, you're neutral, you're not neutered, which means you can't be a complete automatum. You are a person, but recognizing that if I recognize I might be biased towards one party, I've got to challenge myself on that. So it's this deep sense of self-awareness, which also comes from exploring what have my conflicts in the past been, how have I handled them, and it's an ongoing journey of personal growth, which is in fact what I've now created out of the Barefoot Mediator, is this understanding that all of our lives we have a journey with change, challenge and crisis, if you like. And we learn from that, or we have the opportunity to learn from that. But what have we learnt? And the idea that then, we are able to ourselves be self-determining, make our own best informed decisions and allow other people to do the same.
I think that idea of being objective and not judging is essential for a third party like yourself. But while perhaps very, very difficult, would possibly be the key to the primary parties actually resolving their issues as well, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the challenges and as I've trained many professionals, including many lawyers and judges, to be mediators, is our temptation is to step into that professional role where we help people. Let me solve the problem for you. I can see the answer. And particularly if you're a judge, well, if I was a judge, I'd probably be advising this party that, no, that's not my role as a mediator. My role is to simply facilitate that conversation in the moment, actually, Andy. What's going on now in front of me, and can I help that conversation to be better than it would be if I wasn't there?
So, okay, last question for you. Then I have to ask you, with all of this in mind, how often do you fall out with people and what happens then?
No, people do ask me that. Do I fall out with my husband, for example? Yes, of course, and of course, when it's personal to you, you you're not neutral. You're not neutral. But again, I think, well, the feedback from my daughter was this. She went off to university. She said, "Oh, I see all these people falling out with their boyfriends and so on." She said, "You and Daddy have role modelled that you don't sort of shout at each other and you don't fall out. Sure, we disagree with each other and get cross with each other about things, but I think then there's that pulling back and thinking, hang on, there's a better way to manage this, perhaps." So, yeah, it is, and for me, it's a constant challenge. I think it is for all of us. It's not that I'm perfect and I don't do this thing. It's just that awareness that when you start slipping into something that isn't useful, you can pull it back and say, perhaps there's a better way to do this.
Jane, I think that there's no better way to finish that conversation. If people want to find out more, where do they come to find out about what you do and about mediation in general?
So Jane at janegunn.co.uk is my website, is my email address, website janegunn.co.uk. And if people want to email me, I do have a regular newsletter and also video series of tips and tools that I'm happy to let people have access to.
And you've got a workshop coming up as well?
Yeah, so my new workshop that I run is it's a course called the Barefoot Mediator, the Power of Resolutionary Thinking. I'm running it within senior leadership teams and for anybody really who would like to learn more about how to transform their approach to conflict in their lives. And again, I can give you some links to that, Andy, and if anybody's interested in that, the Barefoot Mediator Power Resolutionary Thinking course is up and running.
Fantastic. Well, we can put that in the show notes.
That would be great.
You're welcome to post it onto the LinkedIn, Facebook and YouTube links as well. If you're listening on the podcast, it's janegunn.co.uk and Gunn is spelt with two N's. That's particularly for my American listeners because I know the Gunn's there. They'll go straight for probably lost a few American listeners just saying that. Aww. Jane, thank you so much. If you are listening live, stay with us because we're going to go on now to record our Thursday podcast. In the meantime, Jane, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Andy. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, that's great. I think with Wojciech still with us. I don't know if we have anyone else with us. If you are, feel free to pop comments and questions. It's early on a Friday morning for some people and perhaps just listening and lapping up. I found that really interesting. I think it's such an important topic as well. So as I mentioned to Jane before the call, and I mentioned briefly at the beginning, on the Thursday, we have a 15-minute, roughly, podcast that goes out, which is based around 3 set questions. So we're going to go and look at those. And now we move away from the theme of Jane's expertise, mediation and conflict resolution. This podcast is always purely about professional relationships. Obviously, Jane's experience might come into those answers. But the first question, Jane, is what role have professional relationships played in your career to date?
Huge, I think, Andy. And one of the questions people ask me, as a woman first of all in the legal workplace, and having risen up through that, the challenges that I've come across, and I've got one particular example, if you'd like me.
Please, yeah.
To give that. So this is right back at the beginning of my career. I'm a commercial property lawyer, one of very few women in the field at that stage, and I'm just training. And I'm going into a meeting with my senior partner and an all-male boardroom. And when I arrive in the meeting, the senior partner says to me, "You run the meeting and I'll make the tea." And that for me is an example I've given many, many times, because it would have been so easy for him to say, "Would you go make us all a cup of tea, Jen, and sit in the corner and take some notes?" But he didn't do that. He didn't do that to me as a junior. He didn't do that to me as a woman. And I have learnt from that so much about the sort of respect, the honor, the trust, how to treat a junior, just so many, many lessons come out of that one simple sentence that I can't tell you what that's meant to me over the years. So that's my example.
I think that's a great one. And a couple of things spring to mind. We get themes in answers to this question. And one of the key themes that comes up time and time again is it's people who have shown faith and belief in you. And you've just reinforced that. And a recent guest who's actually, as we're recording this live, it's the current podcast that came out yesterday, is Paul McGee, the sumo guy, and Paul. And Paul shares a very similar story of, when he set up his own training business for the first time, he found someone that would take him on as an associate and gave him a workshop to run. And they said, even though that wasn't perfect, I can see the potential that you have. And that theme has come up time and time again. The other thing that cropped up for me there is also from Paul's podcast, where he said words change worlds. And I think, you've just said it, one sentence, and it made all the difference to you. So as leaders, we can be thinking about how we treat people who are under our charge, how we're bringing them on, how we're showing faith in them and encouraging them and making them feel that they have the capacity to perform at a higher level. And that's what worked for you.
Yes.
So that's
absolutely.
great. Okay, so it's not all wine and roses. It doesn't always go perfectly, as you're perfectly placed to testify. For you personally, at the end of the Monday episode, we talked briefly about where you do have fallouts and how you manage that. But where have relationships gone spectacularly wrong for you, and what did you learn from that experience?
I wouldn't say spectacularly wrong, but I think I certainly have had challenging business relationships along the way. One of the interesting things, I suppose, though, and maybe why I fell into the work that I do, is as a lawyer, people always used to give me the most difficult clients and say, you have them, Jane, you can handle them. So somehow I found a way of calmly dealing with things. And so I guess, when I have had very challenging relationships, it's been for me about the thing I've learnt most is to take a step back and just think about it a little bit. Don't go in with all guns firing, as I'm a gun. Our family motto, actually, the Gun clan motto is either peace or war, in actual fact.
Seems somewhat appropriate, but do you have that on your business card?
So I could go in all guns blazing, most definitely, but I think it is definitely that, just take a step back, take some time to consider, have a conversation with yourself, what's going on here, where do I really want to go? Because I think it is when we react and explode in the moment that we then we can't undo what we've just done. And I guess I've learned, obviously with my background, I've learned even more as the years have gone by. But to be honest, Andy, and as we've alluded to before, I'm still learning. There's a huge amount to learn. I'm still learning the skills. I'm still learning about myself. So there's a lot to process.
Well, let me ask you this, and I don't know, I haven't prepped you for this, and I don't know how easy it is to answer, so feel free to back out. We've talked about where you've fallen out, but in your role, you must have seen some spectacular fallouts for the silliest reasons. So if you can share without breaking any confidentialities, what's the silliest reason that's led to a massive fallout, or an example of something that would fall in line with that?
I suppose things that seem silly to some people, I think often of partners who are splitting up and they fall out about their dog. And, to those of us from outside, you go, well, you can't cut the dog in half, can you? But, there are those kind of things when you're splitting up. It's like, how are we going to cut these things in half? And I think the thing is, what seems silly to us from outside isn't silly when you're in it. If you've got a relationship with your dog or whatever, that isn't a silly thing. So I guess one of the things I see is that, we're trying to understand. I ask people 3 questions, who matters most to you and why? What matters most to them and why? What matters most to you and why? And have you shared that? And when we explore what matters most to people, It can be silly things. It can be silly things. It can be that little, that little thing that's been hanging on the wall that really matters to me. And trying to understand, somebody gave a story about someone took a day off work. So here's a conflict. Somebody took a day off work because their goldfish had died. And everybody's going, wait, And he says, no. My son gave me that goldfish, and it was the last thing he gave me before he died. And, when you dig deep and go, what mattered most to you about that? It was that. It wasn't the goldfish. So it's always, it's not the thing, it's what does it stand for? And that's what I've learned.
Yeah, what it means to you. It goes back to our earlier conversation from the Monday podcast about not applying meanings to other people's actions or words. And that's a great example of it. It's so easy to say, well, that's silly. But thank you. I'm glad I asked that question and put you on the spot. The final question is about what books, what podcasts, what TED Talks or other talks have inspired you along the way and that you'd recommend to other people.
Right. I'm going to give you one book which sits here on my side. This book inspired me to become a mediator. It fell on my head. I was looking for a recipe book in the library and the hardback copy of this fell on my head. So I thought it must be a sign, took it out, read it. The book's called Love, Medicine and Miracles by Dr. Bernie Siegel. Dr. Bernie Siegel was a cancer doctor. I think he wrote the book in the 1970s, or certainly started his work. And he was frustrated with his work as a doctor because he said, I have to look at my patients as their symptoms and their disease. And the same thing, Andy, underneath my patient is an awful lot of life going on. I need to understand that even as a doctor, it isn't about the symptom. I then read that book and thought, why can't we do the same with the legal profession? We're always looking at the headline act, what's going on here, who's broken the contract, what did the law say, what's going on underneath, what's going on in people's lives. So I personally learned a lot from that book, Love, Medicine and Miracles. And actual fact, even as a lawyer, I say I put love at the heart of my work. And that's terribly important for me. What does that mean? It simply means understanding and respecting human beings and what's actually driving their humanness. So that book I would recommend. Currently, I like working with Brené Brown. I think her work on vulnerability is actually very relevant, and looking at the idea of bringing vulnerability into leadership, I think is very interesting now. We used to think of leaders having to be very sort of autocratic and telling people what to do. But again, I think it is about understanding the vulnerability of everybody, and in particular ourselves, and being a vulnerable leader, I think, is also something which is key to understand.
Yeah, that's key. I mean, I certainly know since I published Just Ask that one of the biggest things I'm asked is, and that I've written about, is can leaders be vulnerable? And it's such an important message. I think people are slowly coming around to it. But I had a conversation 2019, it must be. I can always work out if it was a physical meeting, it must have probably been 2019 or before now. It's a help bookmark where I am in terms of conversations. But it was with a senior accountant, very well known partner in a big accountancy firm. And he was still reading from the old diatribe of the young accountants coming up these days. They want to be soft, and they just need to go out and get some fresh air and some exercise. And yes, it was a difficult conversation because I was in the process of writing Just Ask at the time, and leaders now need to know that that's not the model that they should be following, and so that's an absolutely key issue.
Yeah.
Jane, thank you so much. I think we've had two fantastic conversations, some great insights, and I hope people have enjoyed it. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Andy. I've enjoyed it.
Great. So thank you for joining us on another live broadcast of the Connected Leadership Podcast. I know I'm back, I'm pretty sure at the same time next Friday. It might be a bit later because I think it's a guest from America, Sanyin Sang, who's really. I joined Sanyin on a panel from New York a couple of months ago, and I knew I needed to have her on. So look out for that. I'll be publicising it in advance of the event. We've got a few more great interviews coming up for you. As ever, I forget to check my calendar before I come on and do this so that I can give you some dates and times and dates. But I like to give you a surprise. But the interviews are always available on my LinkedIn, YouTube and Facebook pages afterwards, as well as, of course, on the Connected Leadership podcast. So on that note, look out for the future interviews. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Download past interviews on the podcast. And if you're listening live, have a great weekend.